Good evening, Onandal. I am Advocate Anand Kumar, practicing in Delhi High Court. On behalf of our team APLC and on my personal behalf, I welcome you all to the sixth webinar of the series, Design Your Career in Dispute Resolution, by our special speaker, Advocate Anirudh Krishnan, Litigation and Dispute Resolution Specialist. The warmth, the support and participation by the attendees only make us raise our bar with each passing webinar. We owe the entire credit of this webinar to our special speaker, Advocate Anirudhji. After all, we are just providing a stage for the special speaker to connect with the participants and vice versa. For all those who are attending our webinars regularly, you might be knowing us. And for those who have come here for the first time, we are Team AP Legal Chambers, a new age law firm in Delhi NCR with its branch office in Chennai. We started our journey in 2017 with the vision of providing plenary services to our clients and to resolve their legal issues. APLC's portfolio covers a broad spectrum of specialized services, including domestic and international taxation, constitutional laws, IPR, energy law, commercial advisory, and arbitration and corporate compliances. We started organizing webinars out of our passion for law and allied subjects. Witnessing the wonderful response from our participants, we are organizing the webinars on every Thursdays and Sundays. As always, once the special speaker's presentation gets over, we shall be moving to the interactive session. Those who are having any questions to be asked to our special speaker, you can ask it in our chat box. The entire session will be moderated and all your questions will be answered by our special speaker. Tagging from the fifth seminar, we will also be having this segment of APLC's APLC, Ask the Popular Learned Counsel. We shall be asking 2-3 questions from our end, which shall be interesting and also informative. As we all know, dispute is inevitable, but dispute resolution is optional. We have in our midst dispute resolution specialist Advocate Anirudh Krishnan, managing partner, AK Law Chambers. He specializes in arbitration and commercial dispute resolution and insolvency laws and regularly appears before various domestic fora, Supreme Court, various high courts, statutory and arbitral tribunals, and international arbitrary tribunals constituted under various rules including ICC, LCIA, SIAC, and AMTAC rules. He has been recognized by chambers and partners and other publications as a leading practitioner in India in his area of practice. He has been awarded the Rising Star 40 Under 40 title by the Legal Era and has, on being invited, contributed a chapter of his life story in a book titled On the Rise. Quite interesting, isn't it? He is the chief editor of Justice R.S. Bachawat's Law of Arbitration and Conciliation, a treatise often quoted by the Supreme Court and various high courts, and the author of The Law on Reservation and Anti-Discrimination. He also contributed a chapter on third-party funding in arbitration to 2 international publications, namely Handbook on Third-Party Funding in International Arbitration and CPR India Supplement. As a part of special committee set up by the Law Commission of India, he played a key role in drafting a number of India's key commercial legislations, namely the amendment to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996, Commercial Courts Act, and India's Model Bilateral Investment Treaty, BIT. He was also invited by the Justice Sri Krishna Commission to provide his inputs pertaining to further reforms needed in the fields of arbitration and international investment arbitration. The list is endless, and just for the want of time, I stop with this introduction about our special speaker and we welcome him on board. Advocate Anirudh Krishna graciously accepted our invitation without any second thoughts. He will be speaking and covering this very interesting area of dispute resolution. Just like you people, I am also eagerly waiting for his speech. So without taking much of his time, I welcome Anirudh Krishna to APLC's webinar and I hand over this session to you, sir. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anand, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to both the AP Law Chambers and Mr. Anand for inviting me to be here before all of you. It's always a great pleasure to interact with the youngsters. I'm given to understand that most of you are, some of you are students, and majority of you are lawyers with around 1 to 5 years of experience. So it's a great pleasure to sort of share some of my experiences. Anand had mentioned that it would be good if I could intersperse the general talk with some instances from my life and from my career that would be of some interest. And so I thought I would share a few such instances with you during the course of my talk. Let me, while I understand that the webinar is still 7:30, I think you're all going to get really bored if I speak on this topic for more than 40-45 minutes. So I thought I will limit my lecture to about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we could have a Q&A session. The more interactive it is, the more interesting it is. Right? So I'm going to be splitting my talk into various phases, because at the end of the day, there are various, the audience consists of students, of young practitioners, therefore I need to cater to everybody. Let me briefly begin with what you can do in your student life. And I would like to start off by quoting Rudyard Kipling in his poem If, where he says, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And what is more, you'll be a man, my son. Right? So essentially what Rudyard Kipling is saying is that make your time productive. This seems very basic, but where I'm coming to is that in law school today, there are a number of opportunities that are presented before you. You have mooting, you have writing papers, you have projects which a lot of us take initially as being something that is mundane, but take it from me, if you take your project seriously, it's something that's absolutely crucial. But where am I coming from? At the end of the day, as a litigating lawyer, what you do is present facts and present legal concepts to an audience, the audience being the judge. This is exactly what you also do in your presentation, in your paper presentation. Your paper itself is written form of advocacy, helps you in your written form of advocacy. Your presentation helps you in your oral form of advocacy. Trust me that if you take your project seriously, by the end of your 5 years, at least we had 50 projects, even if you've taken 20 seriously, you would have made great progress when it comes to your advocacy. I would also suggest that you take a controversial subject, some gray area of law for your project, and try your best to convert it into an academic article. And during my early days, I was obsessed with mooting. I really wanted to spend all my time doing moots, but I did not make it into the moot court team for the first 2 years. Right? So there happened to be a conference in London on the WTO. One of my friends and I wrote a paper on this, not expecting us to be called for the conference. As it turned out, we were invited, and the minute we mentioned this to our dynamic Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranbir Singh, he went out of his way to organize funding for us, reaching out to senior lawyers who could fund our travel. That provided us a fantastic exposure, and it changed my outlook. Instead of being somebody who was just obsessed with mooting, I realized that there is a lot to gain from other activities in law school as well. So subsequently, I would constantly look out for conferences where I could present papers. I would write a number of articles that would get published. And in the 3rd and 4th year, I also did a fair amount of mooting, which I always wanted to do. What I can vouch for is that when you do these multiple activities, it helps build your personality. it helps you gain those crucial skills that would help you go a long way when you become a litigating lawyer. And because at the end of the day, whether it is a moot court, whether it is a presentation, whether it is a class project, advocacy is about simplifying presentation. Right? So all of these help you improve your advocacy. Therefore, please keep yourself busy doing a variety of articles, a variety of things, articles, moots, etc. While I deal with law school, I will also deal with another important aspect, namely academic writing. This should begin in law school and should continue thereafter. It's something that should keep continuing forever, in fact. Right? Why is academic writing so important? Now, today, as I've already mentioned, one aspect is building your skill set. But there is another angle to this. With the strict regulations that are there on soliciting, if you want to do what they refer to as business development, I don't think it's an accurate term because law is a profession and not a business, but if you want to do business development, and this is a common term used in the Indian scenario, it is through academic writing and being seen at conferences in your areas of specialization. Therefore, it is absolutely critical that you write. In my life, I got an opportunity where I had written a few articles, but in my end of the fourth year, we did a moot and we converted I converted the research that I had done for the moot into a very long article. It was a 70-page article on reservations. Nobody published that article because most Indian journals found it too long. Most foreign journals found it too Indian, as in there was no foreign element when it came to the law of reservations, and therefore all of them refused. I got at least 15 or 20 rejections. Thereafter, I thought, why not I work on this and convert it into a 200-page book? It seemed to be a bit of wishful thinking because I needed to find a publisher. Mr. Vadwa Publishers, his son, was also in Nalsar, Aditya Vadwa, and I mentioned to him, I asked him whether your father would be interested. He put me in touch, and straight away Mr. Vadwa said, you give me a 1,000-page book, give me a treatise that will examine every aspect of the subject and I will publish it. Well, I didn't expect India's leading publisher to be so encouraging, and the minute he said so, I said, yes, I would give you a 1,000-page book. Thereafter, I mentioned this to my vice chancellor and he said, you finish it before you graduate and I'll release it at your graduation. Therefore, my page limit was set, which meant that it could not be a topic-wise commentary, but it had to be it had to cover every single case law because he wanted an extensive commentary. My deadline was set because Professor Ranbir Singh had said prior to your convocation. So my fifth year went in writing a book, and I can tell you that it's made a world of difference to my life. Right? Following this, I had also got the opportunity to edit Justice Bachawat's Law of Arbitration and Conciliation. And all of these open up further opportunities for you. So when you keep at academic writing and build a name in that area, you then get invited to speak at conferences on numerous occasions. This is again a great form of business development because a lot of legal heads of companies attend these conferences. Therefore, if they find that you have substance, they come to you and that's how you get your initial clients. Therefore, speaking at conferences is something that's absolutely critical, and this is something that will come automatically. The opportunities will come if you continuously keep writing. So I would suggest that if you're a student or if you're a young lawyer, please go ahead, set yourself a target. You must try and get an article published once in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Set yourself a target, ensure that you meet that target. You will see in a couple of years' time that opportunities will open up as a result of this. In my case, we looked up at seniors like Mr. Arvind Dattar, who had set the trend in this regard. If you look at Mr. Arvind Dattar, he had published a book in the late 1980s on the law of central excise. and that really catapulted him to the top of the legal profession in the tax side. Right? So therefore, he set the trend. There are others as well, and who've tried to follow the trend that he set. Right? So now this second bit about academic writing and speaking at conferences is something you must start in college, but must continuously keep up at whatever stage of the career. Right? The nature of your talk would be different maybe when you're senior than when you're junior, but please ensure that this is a habit that never dies. Right? So now you have reached a stage where you have started building your name. You're out of college. The next phase is working as a junior. So if you've decided that you want to do litigation, what is the kind of office that you join? In this regard, I would like to quote Claudio Fernandez, who's written a book titled "It's Not the How or the What, but the Who." What she says in the book is that an interview is usually a conversation between two liars. Therefore, the place that you want to join, you're desperate to get there, and so you make a lot of statements that are not accurate, and the interviewer as well makes a number of statements because they want to paint a rosy picture. This is not the way to conduct an interview, both as an interviewer and as an interviewee, because at some point you will become the interviewer as well. You need to be absolutely frank and upright about what you want and your long-term goals. What is very crucial is to choose the right mentor. What you need to understand is that in India, litigation practice is full of pressures. There will be instances where you err. There will be instances where your boss points out to you that you're wrong. Right? For you to really take your boss's advice seriously and to develop, you must have that inherent respect for that boss. Then any amount of criticism from the boss would be taken as positive criticism. Therefore, I would suggest that if you are at the stage of joining an office, please look out for somebody who can be your mentor. Secondly, it is very crucial to join an office where you have direct client interaction. Because ultimately, law is more about the facts than about just the law. Because if you are not thorough in culling out the facts, however good your legal argument may be, you will not succeed. Now, this skill of culling out the facts is a very crucial skill that you need to learn by sitting and quizzing clients on the facts of the case. You will have some clients who will give you some documents who may not give you documents that go against them. If you go ahead and prepare your case without these documents, the other side is just going to produce those documents that are against you. They will say you suppressed it, and that's the end of your case. Right? Therefore, you will have to learn the art of quizzing a client and getting all the facts, true facts out of the client. So for instance, you may have the client give you 10 letters. You must read each of those letters. One of those letters may refer to another letter which the client has not given you. By reading every bit of it, you will get the entire trail. You need to prepare very detailed dates and events on the documents that you have. And therefore, I would suggest please join an office where you have direct client interaction. The other very crucial thing that you need in the first office that you join is you should be part of the decision-making process. Right? What do I mean by this? In some places, decision-making may be outsourced. In the sense, there may be a senior counsel engaged. The senior counsel would decide what is the strategy to be followed by a discussion with the partner of the firm, and you will not be part of the decision-making process. Now, trust me, one of the most crucial skills required in litigation is to know how to strategize your litigation. You should know if you file a civil suit and get a certain kind of interim relief, what are going to be the consequences. If you do not file a civil suit, but instead, if you file an insolvency petition, what are going to be the consequences? Therefore, should you file a civil suit or should you file an insolvency petition? All of these are decisions that you need to take, because in India, a lot depends on the strategy that you adopt when faced with multiple approaches to a problem. I would also suggest that when you are working with a boss, even if you're the junior most in the office, please take these decisions. You need not go and share it with your boss straight away, but internally you should know that what is the decision you would take. Then see whether the decision that your boss takes tallies with it. If it tallies, great. If it doesn't, debate with your boss and try and find out why his decision is correct, or convince him as to why your decision is correct. Therefore, join a boss who encourages such debate and who is going to involve you in the decision making process. The next very crucial aspect is researching and reading. Right? Today, in the internet era, research can sometimes be shortcut research. If you are given a proposition of law, it's very easy to just go Google the proposition or put in the proposition in Manupatra or SEC online, find out the first 2 hits and go and give it to your boss. You may get the answer in 5 minutes, but today, please remember that it's not about getting the case law in 5 minutes. It's about being thorough with the research that you do. I would suggest that you start with a book, because somebody has already done the reading, somebody has already culled out the propositions in a book. And when you read multiple pages of a book, you will also come across other propositions that will stick in there in your head. It's very crucial that you do this, because when you're a junior, you have all the time to read. As you gain experience, when you start your own practice, you may not have the same kind of time. Then you fall back on the library that's contained inside your head. And that library is built up based on the reading that you do. We had the opportunity while working on Bachawat's Law of Arbitration and Conciliation to read 3,000, 4,000 cases. So when you read 3,000, 4,000 cases, you don't read only the arbitration propositions in them. You also go through other propositions of law. And trust me, if you go through a proposition, you may not use it immediately, but even 3-4 years down the line, if the occasion arises, you know that that proposition is there and you just need to find it. Therefore, it's very crucial. How I would suggest that you go about your research is go to the first case on the point. Then feed that into Manupatra and SEC, find all the cases that have followed it. Read everything. Make detailed notes as you read. So you have now, even if you're given a particular proposition, you, in the process of researching on that proposition, have read up about multiple other propositions, all of which will help you in the future. I can give you one example of the great senior counsel, Mr. Vishwanath Shastri. So when he was appearing before the bench of Justice Gajendra Gadkar and Justice Bachawat, he cited a particular decision on a particular proposition. Justice Bachawat shot back saying, Mr. Shastri, this proposition is wrong in light of the decision of the Privy Council in report number so-and-so, page so-and-so. Mr. Shastri shot back immediately. Well, my lords, the judgment that you are referring to has been severely criticized in Halsbury's volume so-and-so, page so-and-so. Therefore, I request you not to go by the Privy Council judgment. Now, Justice Gajendra Gadkar was stunned. He said, okay, let me now, you people are reading off page numbers. I want to actually see whether it's correct. So he called for the reports and found that it was absolutely correct. This is the level of thoroughness that you need to have. Right? And if you are able to inculcate this at a young age, you will always be thorough with the work that you do. Right? Now let's move on to the next stage. You have worked as a junior. You have gained this experience. When do you start your own practice? There are multiple theories on this. There are some people who say, 1 year in a civil office, 1 year in a criminal office, and then you start. Some people who say spend 2 years in an office that is, you choose your area of this broad area of specialization, say commercial disputes, spend 2 years doing commercial disputes, spend 2 years doing general disputes, and then start. People give you a timetable. My approach is different. Now, my approach is that there is no preset formula. You please join an office that permits you to take on your own work. Therefore, during the time you're working with your boss, you will start getting your own briefs. How will you get your briefs? Based on what I told you earlier about based on academic writing, speaking at conferences. You will start getting your own briefs. At some point, you'll realize that the amount of time that you spend on your own briefs is more than 50% of the time that you have. That is, that you spend more time on your briefs than on your boss's briefs. That's the time to go and set up your practice. Again, this is not a preset formula, because you may have other circumstances. Like, for instance, your boss may be practicing in the High Court and may want to be shifting to the Supreme Court. Then you have a practice to inherit. Or your boss may not be a designated senior counsel, but may be about to get designated in the near future, and therefore may not be doing any filing work, therefore will not be doing filing work thereafter. All of these are opportunities. If you are the number 2 or the number 3, these are all opportunities to inherit the practice. Right? So therefore, don't keep any preset formula in mind. What is very crucial is to be patient and wait it out for the right opportunity. Now, when you start, what I would suggest is look out for every opportunity to argue. By default, you should be able to tell the client that I can get you this relief, I will try, rather than saying, well, if I don't get the relief, I may lose the client, therefore let me brief a senior counsel as a safety measure. Right? Of course, there are certain instances where the interest of the client requires you to brief a senior counsel. There may be certain kinds of cases. But if you keep the default rule is that you will argue, then you will automatically realize that clients come to you for your argument and you grow in the profession automatically. Therefore, look out for every opportunity to argue and do your own advocacy. The second thing is, when you are early in your career, there will be tremendous pressure. You will have clients who will create artificial deadlines. You will have referring counsel who create artificial deadlines. You need to be diplomatic in handling all these. You need to find out, well, even if it's an artificial deadline, you try and meet it, you at least send out a draft, you send out some questions to show that significant work has gone on. Because at an early stage in your career, you are judged on every brief. Therefore, you need to ensure that your referring counsels are happy, your clients are happy. Therefore, this diplomacy in handling clients and referring counsel is absolutely critical. This diplomacy would extend to a case where you have lost a case and then you need to go and face a client, right? See, you should, when there are risks involved in the case, you must in a very subtle manner point out the risks in advance. You must gauge the nature of the case. And in some cases where what you need to do, where the case is quite hopeless and the client has very high hopes, those are the cases where you make an exception to the rule and engage a senior counsel. Because then you don't take the blame in case you lose the case, right? Of course, the other cases would be where you feel that before a particular bench, a senior counsel is going to really work. But I can tell you that most judges, at least my practice in the Madras High Court, are very open to hearing you, and it makes no difference whether it's a senior counsel who argues or you, because most judges, I can tell you from the Madras experience, are quite happy to hear a junior as well, who's well prepared, right? Then you must recognize these artificial deadlines from real deadlines. There'll be a lot of clients who will come the previous night and say, we need to file tomorrow morning. There are a number of cases where genuinely you need to file the next morning. Let's assume that a bank guarantee has been invoked. The client would get information from the bank at 4 p.m. Maybe in a day or two, the money is going to go. And then thereafter, any kind of interim relief that you can get would be academic. You will need to file either your suit or Section 9 application next morning, mentioned for a lunch motion. All of this requires recognizing real deadlines and ensuring that these deadlines are met no matter what. So there are multiple occasions where you work through the night. There's an occasion where for some litigation in Hyderabad, we had to do a filing next day. The clients came by 6 p.m. We worked through the night. At 4 p.m., my colleagues took everything with them, got the signatures from the client, rushed to the airport to take a 7 a.m. flight, and the filing was done in Hyderabad. We've had a case where there was a bank guarantee invocation in Kadalur. The client had come to our office only by about 6 p.m. and the client had not really sorted out all the documents. They brought one carton load of documents, dumped it on us. And they were not even sure whether there's an arbitration clause or not. Therefore, what we did was that we got the draft, we got 2 drafts ready while the client searched for an agreement that incorporated the arbitration clause. Because the GCC, the general conditions of contract, contained an arbitration clause, but there was nothing to incorporate it into the main agreement. So we drafted 2, one suit and one Section 9, while the client was searching for the relevant document. So the client found the document at 3 a.m. Therefore, I was simultaneously making changes and finalized the draft by 5 a.m. By which time the clients and my colleagues were in a car on the way to Kadalur, because if you have to file by 10 a.m. in Kadalur, you have to leave Chennai by 3 a.m. Changes were made in the car. The local lawyer in Kadalur had everything printed by the time they reached. It was printed and filed. So these are all very crucial. When there is real urgency, if you are able to execute an overnight filing, if you are able to get an interim order, word will spread that you are somebody who can deliver under pressure, and that will bring in a lot more work, right? So please ensure that when clients come with this kind of urgency, you give it everything to ensure that the filing gets done, right? The next important tip that I want to give you is not to crib about the system. The system is there. You have a lot of people saying, oh, the system is slow, it is so boring, I'm getting bored waiting, I don't know when it's going to be taken up. When a client comes, they tell them, oh no, it'll take 20 years, you're not going to get any relief. Please realize that the system is there. You've chosen to enter the system. Now, don't crib about the system. Learn how to work the system to your benefit, right? Realize how you can get an interim order that will cripple the other side, so they will force the other side to come for a settlement talk, right? You need to understand not just the law, but also the commercials in a case. So for instance, if you know that you get an interim order and it's going to take months for the other side to vacate that interim order, then you can use the system to your advantage. Therefore, it's very crucial to think out of the box and ensure you knock on the right door. Let me give you a couple of instances which have really mattered to me in my career. So when I was still quite young in the profession, my boss, I was earlier working, before I joined the bar, I was at Clifford Chance in London for a couple of years, and then I was with the senior counsel, Mr. Murari, for a year, and then I started my practice. My boss at London got in touch with me. He was then a partner of Jones Day. He put me in touch with the arbitration partner of Jones Day, who had a litigation in Singrauli district. I did not know where Singrauli district was at that point. I was just excited that a partner of Jones Day was giving me this brief. There was an anti-arbitration injunction suit that was moved in Singrauli by Reliance, and they had got an injunction restraining a foreign-seated arbitration from proceeding. So when I got the brief, I was too happy to take it up, and then I Google mapped where Singrauli is, and to my shock, it said 17 hours from Chennai. So I had to take 2 flights, Chennai to Delhi, Delhi to Varanasi. From Varanasi to 7.5 hours by car. And we've literally seen this area develop, because when we started the litigation, it was 7.5 hours by car. By the time we completed the litigation, it was 4.5 hours by car. So we realized that Reliance, after getting the interim order, were going to play the game of attrition. Because for them, their senior counsels flew down from Delhi in a chopper which landed next to the court. They were there in 1 hour. We were trekking all the way. So we realized that we need to do something, otherwise we're going to lose this game of attrition. 10 times we go up and down to Singrauli, we would have really been frustrated by the end of it. So what did we do? We found a stray Madhya Pradesh High Court judgment that said that against an ex parte order, an appeal will lie. Please note, most of the high courts have judgments to the contrary, saying that you have to file a vacate injunction under Order 39 Rule 4. But Madhya Pradesh had one judgment which said that you could directly file an appeal. So we filed the appeal. We went before the appellate court and said, we are not going to trouble you on merits. Please just set a timeline of 1 month for the lower court. Timeline was set. We then went back to the lower court. Before the lower court, filed a vacate injunction, filed an application under Section 45 for referring the matter to arbitration. The lower court heard us, but granted the other side an adjournment beyond the 30-day period. We went back to the High Court and said, you have given a direction of 30 days, that is being breached. The High Court then said, keep this matter pending. I am adjourning this by 10 days. In the meantime, the trial court must decide the matter. Therefore, in about 45 days, we had this anti-arbitration injunction suit dismissed and referred to arbitration. Right? Had we not gone to the Madhya Pradesh High Court, we would possibly still be before the Singrauli District Court. At the end of the day, this was a nothing to lose approach, because if the Madhya Pradesh High Court had dismissed it saying we're not going to set a timeline, we would have lost nothing. So you need to realize which are the doors that you need to knock on. If you knock on 4 doors, at least 2 will open. You need to be ready to think out of the box when you know that you are up with a systemic challenge or with a tricky situation. In such a scenario, the easiest thing is to tell the client, well, you have no solution. It's going to take you 10 years. Okay, we'll fight it. Sorry, stop the litigation. Stop the arbitration. Most clients today are very intelligent clients, and they realize that there is a difficulty. They come to you to solve a problem, not to tell them that they have a problem and no solution. So you need to be ready to think out of the box in order to provide best possible legal support to the clients. I can give you another instance that is very close to my heart. So a client had come to me, an English solicitor had come to me for executing an English decree. As you all know, the traditional route is to file an execution petition, which is a terribly slow process. Assets based on the balance sheet of 2 years earlier. See, assets were located across Tamil Nadu and Kerala, and we would have to file multiple EPs. It would have been time consuming and a very slow process. So I suggested that. I also realized something was fishy and suspicious, because this company, ever since the litigation had begun in England, the defendant company had not filed its balance sheets. So I felt that maybe they have gone ahead and siphoned away all their assets. And they had started participating in the English proceedings, and after a particular stage had not participated. Therefore, we realized that, okay, this EP route is going to be hugely problematic. So I suggested, why not we, at that time the insolvency and bankruptcy code was quite new and untested. So there was no precedent, but I said, listen, this is a nothing to lose option. We will use the decree as the proof of debt rather than the source of debt, and file a petition under the IBC. Let's see if we can get an RP appointed. We will also know what's gone on. We'll know about all these transactions inside the company. Well, worst case, what's going to happen in 4 months, it's going to get dismissed. Then we will always go back to the traditional route that's anyway going to take 2 years. The solicitor agreed, and we took this aggressive route. We won 3 rounds of litigation, NCLT, NCLAT, Supreme Court, within a period of about 10 months. We got an RP appointed. My suspicion was right. There had been a transaction with a Singaporean company and with a company in Netherlands. We went to Singapore and got an injunction against that company as well. At the end of the day, we also filed petitions for setting aside all these transfers as they were all fraudulent transfers. With all this pressure, the Netherlands and Singaporean company came to the negotiating table and they paid off the entire principal sum, which was a huge victory in a very short period of time. Therefore, what I would suggest is that you look out for opportunities, look out for out-of-the-box solutions when the traditional solution is not going to work. It's very crucial to do this and to remain positive. Treat this as a challenge rather than an obstacle. If you treat the system this way, trust me, every day will be a challenge that you will love in this profession. Right? While doing all of this, what is very crucial to remember is you need to maintain your level of ethics. Right? When I say out of the box, I mean out of the box within the rule book. Because once you spoil your reputation, that's the end of it. Right? It's very crucial to not be opportunistic, to be patient, because opportunities will come if you do the right things in this profession. It's also very crucial to not cross the line. If you cross the line, well, it's inevitable that all of you will cross the line at some point. It's happened to the greatest. In fact, there's a very interesting anecdote in Mr. Fali Nariman's autobiography, where he says that after he became the great Fali Nariman, he was asked by Chief Justice Lahoti to consider retiring from the profession. So because he had snapped at the other side lawyer while the other side lawyer was trying to make a submission. Justice Lahoti retired, saying, Mr. Nariman, you must consider retiring. Well, if it can happen to the very best in the profession, it can happen to everybody. But what is very crucial is to recognize that you have crossed the line and do a course correction at the earliest. Right? It happens to everyone, but please ensure that you are aware that you have crossed the line. And it's important to introspect continuously. And while speaking of introspection, I think you must also introspect on styles of various counsel. Closely observe everybody who's arguing. There'll be one counsel who is brilliant at presenting a concept. There'll be another counsel who may be brilliant at arguing a tough case, who may be brilliant at giving a spin to a tough case. There may be somebody else who's very good with intermodals. Try and pick out the best from each, and also note silently where somebody errs, where somebody, say, irritates a judge. And so then you will have in your mind a set of do's and do nots. Right? Now, before I conclude, let me just give you some general tips. I was reading this article by Wanda Thibodeaux on doers versus achievers. What is it that doers do and what is it that achievers do? Achievers set long-term goals and work backwards from there. So when you start your career, you set for yourself where is it that you ultimately want to be 30 years from now. It can be an audacious goal. In fact, there's a very nice piece by Zig Ziglar that is referred to by Mr. Arvind Datar in one of his pieces, where goals have to be audacious. In fact, Mr. Datar refers to the goal of a lady who had her legs amputated, whose audacious goal was to climb Mount Everest, and she achieved it. Therefore, set yourself audacious goals, work backwards, and break it down into sub-goals. So if you want to be the #1 senior counsel in the country 30 years from now, look at how you can achieve it, and break it down into smaller goals, break it down into sub goals, break it down into daily goals. Set yourself a list of what all you need to do on a daily basis, your immediate deadlines. Set yourself medium-term goals, saying, okay, during this phase, I want to try and build up a practice on these areas. And how do you get there? Go back to my academic writing, go back to my conferences, right? Work out a strategy. Don't just proceed aimlessly. The second is, achievers know how to delegate. So find the right people in your office and then delegate once you have the confidence that they'll execute. Identifying the right person is key, but then if you're going to sit and get into every aspect, there's only that much work that you can do. Right? Therefore, delegation is absolutely critical. The last is, don't be a jack of all trades, try and be a master of them. Identify that one crucial area where you think you can really achieve success. If it's general litigation, it's general litigation. A lot of people have one or two specializations which is coupled to the general litigation. So identify those areas and try and become a master of that area. Right? A lot today, I think we are not yet at an age where there is super specialization, but there is a broad level specialization. Therefore, you may look at, say, constitutional law and commercial disputes as two areas that you can pursue. Those are, because there would be a lot of commercial writs and all of those as well. But if you're looking at every area, I want to do criminal law, I want to do murder, I want to do white collar, I want to do tax, I want to do arbitration. Well, I think today we are in an era where there's a little more specialization than that. Right? So therefore, these are all some general tips and a few instances from my life. I think it will be better if we make this session interactive. I think we have about 35 minutes. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anirudh, for this wonderful, entertaining, and at the same time very lively session that which you have presented now. You have shared your life experience as well as given tips for the youngsters. Just briefly wrapping this your speech, I entirely agree with you in respect of what you told as boss junior relationship. In fact, I was lucky to have worked under a boss who almost involved me in almost all the important decision making matters. And in fact, he is present in this webinar. He is encouraging me and also all the other team members here, Mr. N.R. Bhuvarahan, who was very kind, and also he was shaping our career in a way that when we started our career independently, we had a lot of takeaways from these trainings and long hours of rigorous practice which he inculcated in us. The habit or this thing which you call the trait or the style of Mr. Bhuvarahan has helped us in a long way in understanding the nuances of law, or for that matter taxation. Yeah. Moving on to the next point which you told, there are a lot of takeaways for the youngsters who are attending this session. Young and raw mind is the best to tune and mold as a professional. The young mind can be shaped, and this is the best time for you people to learn a lot of things, learn the basics right. Then the bold decisions you take while you are a junior counsel comes a long way in helping you when you start your practice independently. Then face the challenges, take up the risks, and rise above the rest. Wow, that was really a fantastic and encouraging words which you told. And I am sure people who listen this, and also those who will be viewing your presentation once it is being uploaded in YouTube, will have a lot of positive things to take. Then when you told about not to crib about the system, if you want to change the system, better be the part of the system. Then rise to the top and change if you really want to change the system. Then one oxymoron type of thing which you told really impressed me, thinking out of the box within the framework. So I think this is a bit oxymoron type, but at the same time thinking out of the box is very, very essential. And at the same time, when one thinks that I need to really think out of the box, there he can easily find out way. And where there is a will, there is a way. And then one important aspect which you touched upon was the code crafts. Code crafts are such things which cannot be read and understood by reading the textbooks or the other reference material which are available both offline and online. But these code crafts are only skills which can be developed or harnessed by witnessing the senior counsel's arguments, or for that matter any other counsel who has been already left an indelible mark in his career. So that is the thing which has to be followed by each and every one of us. Codecraft is an art in itself, and it has to be mastered by all the people, especially those who are coming into this area of practice. So wrapping up this presentation by you, I think this has a lot of things which people will go home and ponder. Now moving on to the next segment, which is called APLC's APLC. That is APLC's Ask the Popular Learned Counsel. We have framed a set of questions which we think would be relevant to this particular topic, will be interesting, as well as will be entertaining to all these people who are attending this webinar. So with your permission, I think let me ask you the first question. So just like the lesser artists and greater artists in the field of art, do you think there are lesser advocates and greater advocates in the field of advocacy? Considering the vast difference or the area of expertise these people have got, and the vast difference or the input which they have got in their particular field, do you think is there any middle ground? Do you think there are only greater advocates and lesser advocates? What is your take, sir?
No, I would not see, if you are to use a term like lesser advocates, I would only use it for somebody who does not follow the proper ethical code of conduct. So for me, that is absolutely crucial. As an advocate, everybody has pluses, everybody has minuses. You have, as I was mentioning, you may have a particular lawyer who's excellent for setting out a concept. You may have some other lawyer who's very good to get you interim relief. So I don't think it is a question of lesser advocate or greater advocate. It's a question of, okay, specific strengths and specific weaknesses. So as an advocate, you try and see how you can gain all the strengths of a number of other advocates. Rather than trying to ape one particular advocate, you try and see the positives of each of them and try and imbibe it and practice it when you are.
Yeah, just tipping one more question in this. Do you think sustainability is more important, or aspiring for our goals and reaching the goals is more important? Do you think a person who is practicing in tier 2 city or 3 city should be contented enough to practice in this area and leave his mark in that particular area of practice in that particular court? Or do you think he has to aspire and aim for higher grounds? Whether sustainability is more important or reaching your aim is more important?
Well, I think it depends on what each person's aim is. So if somebody wants to do a particular, say, if somebody wants to be somebody's aim is to be a top high court advocate in a particular state, then obviously they need not look at venturing out outside that state. If somebody wants to be a top senior in the country, they will certainly have to look at the Supreme Court at some point of time. You may have others who may want to build an international arbitration practice, who may look at spending 2 months a year in London, 3 months a year in London. Therefore, aims differ. Based on each person's goal, they'll have to find a way of achieving those goals in a sustainable manner.
Thank you, Anirudh. I think we need to find a balance between achieving our goals as well as sustaining in our profession. So moving on to the next one. So there is a thing called scalability, winnability, and sustenance. So which is more important as a young practitioner who wants to start his individual firm? Whether scalability in his profession or winnability at any cost without all-out punch, or sustenance, a gradual growth, which is more important for a young advocate?
Well, I think when you look at winning at any cost, again, at any cost within the framework is something that I think that fire in the belly you must have. I'm saying that at any cost cannot mean by using means that are not ethical, but within the ethical framework, winning at any cost is that fire in the belly is crucial. If the other side comes and destroys your argument, you should be able to have that fire in the belly to come back and say, well, I know that I can come up with a solution, whoever the other side may be. So I think that is absolutely crucial. Yet, of course, you need to have patience, because there are, when you read the autobiographies of a number of great lawyers, a lot of them did not have briefs for a very long time. So you need to be patient to get your briefs. But when you get that brief, that urge to succeed must be there, because without that fire in the belly, you're not going to become successful in litigation.
Yes, sir, I agree with you. While you were giving your presentation, I was glad that you touched upon a particular point in the topic when you said, what is the correct time for a person to start an independent practice? Though it is subjective, but I would like to touch upon one particular point, be it advocacy, chartered accountancy, whether it is in the field of medicine. Shall I continue or shall I just wait?
Sure, you go ahead. I'm hearing you.
Now, be it in the field of advocacy, chartered accountancy, or for medicine, Guru Shishya tradition is followed in almost all the professions. The senior junior connect. People think nowadays it is a swag if they say that they are going to start their own practice immediately after enrolling in the bar without getting proper training from the seniors. In fact, we get to know so much from them if we are training under them for a particular period of time. The argument that these people keep here is that there is a whole new dimension to practice when you start exploring and experiencing it of your own. They say there is a world of opportunities to the advocates in areas where they require little to or close to zero training under a senior. So I would like to hear from you, sir. What is your take on this? So is it a swag or is it really a thing which need to be seriously addressed to the young people, young advocates?
No, I would not agree that you can straight away start off on your own. You certainly require some level of, training. There are huge positives that you can gain. So it's how soon are you in a position to gain it is dependent on how fast you learn and how hard you work when you're there. But at the end of the day, without that training, you're going to be making a lot of basic mistakes. And you make 4 or 5 of these, word will spread that this is a fellow who practices without knowing the basics. So I would certainly not advise this starting off on your own straight away without working under somebody and learning the tricks of the trade.
So this Guru Shishya or the senior junior tradition, I think that has to be kept intact.
Certainly.
So the time frame may differ, but I think what at the end of the day, at least we need to have a certain level of training under a senior to start off our individual practice.
Yes.
So there are a lot of questions that are being asked in the chat. So without delay, I will just wrap this our APLC questions and quickly move on to the questions asked by our participants.
Okay, sure.
So the first one is by Mr. Arun Kumar Subramaniam. Do you think one can taste the same amount of success if one switches his path from proper litigation advocacy to a dispute resolution professional, considering the unorthodox ways involved in this?
No, dispute resolution is wide enough to cover litigation. So I don't I don't think the question is an appropriate question, because you're looking at, when I'm saying dispute resolution, I'm referring to all forms of dispute resolution: regular litigation, plus arbitration, plus practice before tribunals, etc. So you're not looking at the shift. You can do everything today. Again, as I mentioned, that there is some level of specialization. I'm not saying a great level of super specialization, but some level of specialization.
So I think you don't even accept the word that it is an unorthodox area of practice. It's normal litigation.
Not different from litigation. So there's no question of shifting from litigation to dispute resolution. Litigation is part of dispute resolution.
So I think he might be trying to ask you that if he wants to entirely switch his career from proper litigation counsel to a person who is involving in only dispute resolution professional activities.
No, what do you mean? I'm not able to understand the question. Dispute resolution professional is the same as litigation professional. What is the difference?
Yes, I think with this we will move on to the next question. It is by Mr. Muthu. Filing PIL. If a person wants to file a PIL without any prior experience, is there any means as to how he can stand alone without the experience of a senior counsel, and he wants to take it up individually?
There's no reason why you should not do it if it's for a valid cause. Most courts are going to encourage you if it's for a valid cause. But if it's more of publicity seeking, then I would seriously advise against it. Because if you have any adverse remarks passed against you at any time of your career, especially when you're young, that's going to stay forever.
Yes, sir. I think Mr. Muthu would have got his answer. Moving on to the next one, it is by Mr. Rohit. How can one decide as to when he can start his career as a dispute resolution professional individually?
I already mentioned the criteria during my talk.
Yes, I think you have briefly covered this one.
Yeah.
And it is up to the person to decide if he is confident enough, he can take up this.
No, I said that you start doing your own work when you're with your senior. Ensure that you get a senior who permits you to do that. And at the stage where you think that you're spending more time doing your own work than your boss's work, that's the time to start off. Again, you look at other opportunities, like for instance, if there's any chance to inherit a practice. If you think that there's an opportunity, okay, sticking on longer, you could inherit a practice, that may be a far faster way of building your career. So if your senior is going to be designated, or a senior is going to shift to the Supreme Court, then you certainly have a huge opportunity there. So there is no preset formula, but you need to, this is a broad thumb rule that you can consider.
Yes, I think it is up to the individual to decide when is the right time for him to change the tracks.
Yeah.
Then moving on to the next question, it is by Mr. Prasoon Vasishtha. Sir, do you think dispute resolution mechanism has got everything in it to redress the dispute and settle the case, or it is just a try?
Well, every dispute resolution, if there is a dispute and you've suffered loss, you have no option but to proceed with the dispute resolution or litigation. You have no other option. Unless if parties are not negotiating and settling, this is the only route available.
Just tipping over this question. So as you are mentioning about the art of negotiation, can you just briefly discuss about what is that in particular? So how can one develop his skill in that particular art of negotiation? If you could just, out of your own experience, yeah.
There are trained mediators. There are trained people who are actually trained in that. So there are a lot of technicalities of suggesting the best alternative, suggest the solution, suggesting the worst alternative solution. So, but what is crucial, and there are people trained. I'm not one of those who's trained in mediation. There are a lot of them who are trained. But I have seen some fantastic suggestions emanate from trained mediators. And I think mediation is especially when there are two private parties, because if one side is the government, they usually don't settle because there'll be a CVC inquiry against the person who signed off on the settlement. But if it's between two private parties, you must certainly try and have a negotiation. Most negotiations, the biggest mistake you can make in a negotiation is by making it a fight on merits. A negotiation should be driven from the commercials. If this is going to continue for the next 10 years, if this land is stuck up, so you take an example of a joint development agreement, right? If the land is developed and both parties share the proceeds of the sales, they will be better off, both will be better off than fighting over the land for the next 10 years and waiting for 10 years before anybody can purchase it. Right? So these are kind of commercial solutions that need to be reached rather than strictly legal. Though I would say that law has a role, because if a party is making a claim without any case, and the other party is going to look at the merits of that case and say, well, why should I pay him anything? I might as well have it dismissed. So yeah, so these are the keys to negotiation and mediation. There are a lot of specialized courses if anybody is interested. I can put you on to people who handle this if you're interested.
Yeah, just moving forward with this particular question. So I think, do you think it is equally important for both the parties to have equal weightage when going in for a negotiation or for trying to have a solution? Or do you think a tilted balance to a particular party will lead to a what do you call a better negotiation for that party and a worse negotiation for the other one?
Yes, certainly.
In Mahabharata, when Kauravas had adequate number of soldiers in their hand, but still, when he wanted to negotiate, when Krishna came for negotiation, they did not heed, considering that they had an upper hand with respect to the number of soldiers or respect to the warriors which they held. But unfortunately, the balance tilted in favor of Pandavas. So, do you think a negotiation in that particular time would have resulted in an equal win-win situation for both Kauravas and Pandavas, or for that matter, any general particular arbitration and commercial litigations? So, what is your take, sir?
Yes, certainly I would advocate negotiating and settling it, because there are a lot of uncertainties when it goes to a dispute resolution. There are a lot of situations where you think you'll win, but you lose. There will be something that the other side has in their armory which you're not aware of. So I would always suggest that if it is possible to settle, negotiate and close it, please do so. But of course, bargaining power has a lot, because there's one party who is going to have the upper hand, and that party may not want to change the status quo, right? So what that party has to remember is that if even 5-6 years down the line, he's going to lose that case, things are going to be much worse off. Therefore, as the saying goes, a bad settlement is better than a good victory. Because even after you win a case, you get a decree, you have to go and execute the decree. Whereas if settlement on day one, both parties get something out of it, it's a win-win. They walk away with something on day one rather than fighting for 10 to 15 years in the long term of litigation.
Yes, I think this dispute resolution always emphasizes on win-win, even though win-win may not be possible in all the scenarios. Yeah, thank you, sir. Moving on to the next one. It is by Ms. Nisha Sachdeva. As we are a first-generation lawyer, how to get into a corporate law firm? Firms require some reference which we don't have. So how to secure our position in corporate firms? So this has been a general question in the minds of so many advocates and young advocates who want to start their career in a corporate law firm, but they do not find any reference or any push from the known source. So what is your take, sir?
Mostly you do it out of college, fresh out of college, because you have recruitment committees in your college that organize recruitments. So that's how a lot of people I know get into corporate law firms. The other way is that there are, I think, headhunters, like some Bakura. Then there are a lot of these headhunters who I'm given to understand look out for people both on behalf of a corporate law firm. So if you fit the description of the person that of the kind of lawyer the corporate law firm wants, then that is a way in which you can get in. So yeah, these are all ways. Otherwise, just keep your eyes and ears open. You will come across a partner of the law firm. Approach the partner, because if the partner is convinced that you are really good and they want to take you, then in all probability they will be able to take you.
Sir, just touching in one more, adding one more question to the same question. You may feel free to just skip this question also. The second generation advocates versus first generation advocates. This has been a matter of discussion for quite some time now. Generally, first generation advocates do not have a launch pad. Do you think, coming from a person from an advocate background, from a family where you have gotten a cushion, do you think the life would have been different for you if not for you being a second generation advocate? And do you see a clear disparity in first generation advocates and second generation advocates? If yes, what are the steps do you suggest to curb the disparity?
See, it's a good question. Certainly, there is an advantage being a second generation advocate. I would look at it as a head start of 3 to 4 years, because on day one there is a little bit of recognition. There's also a client base where, or at least a few references. I won't say client base, but a few references that may come your way. Like there are some who will inherit a practice straight away. In my case, I didn't join the same firm. I started my own practice, but certainly there will be references to clients that will help boost your career initially. It gives you a 3 to 4 year head start over the others. But in those 3 to 4 years, if you don't deliver, take it from me, no client is going to stick to you. In fact, if you don't deliver, it will be counterproductive, because people will say, "Oh, his father was very good. He was really bad. He's really bad." So therefore, if you're good, it provides you a 3 to 4 year head start. Otherwise, how would you be getting clients? Through this academic writing, through conferences where you meet people and they come to know about you. So, say the number of clients you would get referred would be maybe equivalent to 4 years of business development. So in that sense, you certainly have a head start. But that said, I strongly believe that today there is enough opportunity even for first generation lawyers to really make it up. There are a number of examples of first generation lawyers who have made it early. You just need to ensure that you are constantly in the public eye with your academic writing and speaking at conferences. Ensure that, and then the minute a few clients come, more will come, because when they hear you argue in court, word will spread that this guy is good, then more will come. Like, I can certainly say that when I started off, there were 4 or 5 of my clients who came on their own, independent of the reference. I may not have been able to scale up at the speed if I was not a second generation lawyer, and certainly the backing helped in that sense. But I would have been able to build on these 4 or 5 clients and develop a practice and scale up 4 or 5 years down the line, rather than at the stage that I did. So my answer is that yes, it helps to be a second generation lawyer, but as a first generation lawyer, if you have that patience and perseverance in the early part of your career for that 4 or 5 year phase, then you can always catch up.
Yes, sir. I am sure that second generation advocates definitely have a head start. But do you think equally they have got pressure to perform each and every time and try to emulate or succeed in a much better way than their predecessors or the first generation advocates?
Well, yes, there is certainly some kind of pressure, because if you do not do a good job, more people are going to note that you've not done a good job around you. And because they keep an eye out, oh, so-and-so's son has now come to, he's appearing, let's see how he does. If you do a bad job, then opinions are formed, right? So the opinions can be either good or bad. That depends on how you take it. So there is certainly some pressure in case you don't do a good job. But if you look at it as an opportunity rather than as a pressure point, then it works well.
So comparatively, when a first generation advocate tries to argue in the court, he might not feel the same heat like how the second generation or third generation advocates feels, for that matter. But do you think
it's not the initial 2-3 year period? After that, it's all sort of a little more normalized. But that initial head start, that initial period, yes, when people are not, you have a chance to make more mistakes without getting noticed for each mistake if you're a first generation.
Mr. Anil, what do you think success is according to you?
Well, that's a very philosophical question. So I think I think that there's no preset formula for it. It's in different ways of life. Success is different. So I think it's about doing your best in whichever area that you take up, not just professional but also personal, and knowing that you've done your best, because beyond that, results are not within your control.
So quickly moving on to the next one, that was well answered. Moving on to the next question. It is by Mr. Krishnan PE,
Okay.
Mr. AK, as we all know, there are so many areas in law profession where we can focus and be specialized. Would you be able to suggest a few which are in limelight, especially for youngsters and advocates who start their practice at later stage of their life?
So commercial disputes, which will involve contractual disputes, arbitration, matters before the commercial courts, some commercial writs. This is a good area. Then tax is always an evergreen area. Then I think today criminal law, especially areas such as prevention of money laundering and Benami prohibition, all of these are also good emerging areas. So these are all a few areas that you can keep in mind.
So I practice income tax laws. So considering the current situation, tax laws would be the area, the last area I would prefer to other advocates, considering how our government is taking tax professionals for granted and tax laws for granted. So what do you think, sir? Do you need? Do you think there need to be a change in the entire setup of taxation policies in India, or it is just that due to the situation that has demanded the government to take certain steps?
Frankly, I think you are better placed to answer this because I am not somebody who does too much tax. So I must accept my ignorance of the nitty-gritties of taxation practice and policies in relation to taxation. Therefore, I think it's something that you would be better equipped than me to answer.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll leave it for the attendees to decide. Moving on quickly to the next question. It is by Maithili Jha, Ms. Maithili Jha. What are your views on the 2019 amendment of the Arbitration Conciliation Act 1996 with special reference to the Arbitration Council of India and the future of arbitration in India?
See, I feel that I'm a little apprehensive about some of what you find in the 2019 amendments. Like when you're looking at the Arbitration Council of India, you're looking at a great government interference when it comes to grading institutions, arbitral institutions. Considering that the government is today the biggest litigant, even in the field of arbitration, that could prove to be a little risky. Second is that if the grading is not done in a proper manner and you have institutions that are dishonest, accredited, then the mechanism in there where you don't even go to court for appointment of an arbitrator under Section 11, but directly go to such an institution could prove detrimental because the whole the integrity of the system is at stake. We have borrowed all of this from, when you look at the Justice Sri Krishna Committee report, they refer to Hong Kong and Singapore. It may work there because in both Hong Kong and Singapore, they are small countries with one very credible institution already. In India, with so many states, you may have credible institutions in a few states. Chennai, you have Tamil Nadu, you have Nani Palkhiwala Arbitration Center, you have MCI in Bombay. Delhi, you may again have NPSC, and you have this new center, you have high court centers. But most states, you don't have a credible institution. So I think we should have been a little slower in moving towards this approach. And anyway, let's hope that I'm proved wrong when the Arbitration Council of India is actually set up.
Mr. Anirudh, I would like to know whether you have played your part in this amended Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996.
2015 amendments, I was part of the Law Commission Special Committee to draft it. So I played an active part as part of Justice A.P. Shah's committee. In 2019, I was called to make a presentation, but they gave specific areas. So there were two areas that they were looking at, the Justice Sri Krishna Committee. They looked at amendments to the Arbitration Act and they looked at bilateral investment treaties. So they called for, so they identified about 15 of us and asked us to make presentations on specific areas. My topic was in relation to bilateral investment treaties. So I made a presentation on that. I did have a few other suggestions which I had communicated to them on the 2019 amendments as well.
Thank you. Just for making the audience understand how taxing are these commitments or projects which have been handed over by these particular courts or legislators. How taxing it is. Yeah.
Well, it certainly involves a lot of work. It certainly involves a lot of work. I've also been involved with the Madras High Court Arbitration Committee and drafting the rules for the Madras High Court Arbitration Center and all of these. It certainly involves a lot of work, but I think it's something that I thoroughly enjoy because it's very good to be part of framing the policy for the country going forward. So it was something that I thoroughly enjoyed, and under Justice A.P. Shah's leadership, it was a phenomenal experience because Justice A.P. Shah is open to taking views from anybody. It doesn't make, so we were sitting, I was the youngest member in the committee. There were a number of senior counsels, some of them have now become judges, and he would not mind taking your view. Age was really not a criteria. It was a fantastic experience. Of course, it involved a lot of work, and today I can say I hugely benefit from it because most of these amendments have been carried out. The 2015 amendments are 90% of them are based on the Law Commission report. So today it's a huge benefit when it comes to interpreting the law because it's I understand the why behind the amendment.
Yes, sir. Is consensus possible considering that people are coming across the length and breadth of India? Is consensus in finalizing the bill is possible? Or each of you give your own independent report or findings and points?
So I would say on 80 to 90% of the issues, there was consensus. There were about 10% of the issues where there were vast differences. Ultimately, where there were differences, Justice Shah heard us all out and then took the final call on it. And then we worked with him on further fine-tuning it. So it was, yeah, I would say 90% of the issues there was consensus.
Yeah, thank you, Anirudh, for sharing your personal experience and also enlightening our audience here. So we have one last question, one quick question before we finally wrap this one. We are really running out of time. Ms. Suhasini wants to know the do's and don'ts in managing client relationship.
See, you need to be politely firm. You need to be diplomatic. Right. Ultimately, you may have some clients who are absolutely upfront, who are a pleasure to deal with, because then you can tell them frankly what are the strengths, weaknesses of the case. You may have others who have impossible expectations. So where you have such clients, you will have to diplomatically, politely point out the weaknesses also involved. Of course, tell them how you're going to get over it and give them a plan. So don't just tell them the problem. When you tell them the problem, give them the solution as well. That's a way of handling this. You also need to ensure that some clients will work facts from you. You need to, when you get such clients, you need to put your foot down because ultimately your credibility is at stake if an important fact is worked before court. So in those kind of situations, you need to be very firm with the client and ensure that there's complete transparency. You also need to ensure that where there is a controversial issue where you're giving, say, for some undertaking or you're conceding on some angle, you ensure you get written instructions on all of this. Because tomorrow you don't want the client to go back and say, oh, I never instructed the lawyer this way. So all of these you will learn with experience, and we continue to learn as we move up in the, anyway, all of us have a long way to go. All I can say is that the first couple of steps have perhaps been thanks to have due to the blessing of elders, and God have been in the correct direction. But we all have a long way to go because this is a long profession and there are twists and turns of the way.
Yes, Anirudh, it is equally important to get a lot of clients, but it is also equally important to put your foot firm on the ground and tell what is right and wrong. So the best two takeaways which I personally feel is the two oxymorons which you have told today. Thinking out of the box within the framework and being politely firm. We have got a very, very last question coming up for the day. And I think Ms. Suhasini would have got the answer which she was expecting. And moving to very last question by Mr. Lalit Kumar Gar. What is the minimum qualification for a mediation professional? With this, we can
I don't think there are any qualifications. Subject to correction, I don't think there are any qualifications. You can always go get trained as a mediation professional, whether or not you are in law. Even if you're outside law, you can train to become a mediation.
Yes, Mr. Lalitji, I think if you're really interested, you can take training and become a mediation professional in the future. Yeah, thank you. And with this, we are wrapping this wonderful session. I wholeheartedly thank our special speaker Anil Krishnan ji for this wonderful presentation, sharing the all important personal experience and all important nuances of this profession. The hard work which has gone under way during his journey has also been shared by him, and also he has equally emphasized on the importance of practicing under a senior counsel, at the same time growing your own brand as a junior counsel, as well as starting your firm independently. So all these things, I think, are sure our attendees will be getting benefit out of this. And you are equally candid in answering the questions, and also you have answered the terrains which are a bit uncomfortable for other people. You have equally handled that with Ilan, and I thank you once again for this wonderful session.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you so much for providing me this platform to present before so many youngsters. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Anirudhji. With this, we wrap this session. There are a lot of exciting webinars coming up. The next one is on Sunday. It is please keep a tab on our page to know about more about the topic. And I also request you all people to watch the videos which have been already uploaded in our YouTube channel. So with all these takeaways from this webinar, it is from Team APLC, and on my personal behalf, I thank all the participants for attending this webinar, and I request you all to kindly support and encourage us in the upcoming webinars also. So it is Anand signing off. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Meet you in the next webinar.